It is my great pleasure to be able to pass you now across to Jason Murphy, the Chair of the ACCA Ireland Committee. Thank you.
Thanks, Lloyd, and welcome everybody to today's session. This is my first actual session as Chair of ACCA Ireland, so I'm delighted to be here in front of all of you. And this is a really important topic today in terms of a really interesting area for all ACCA members and employers. So delighted to welcome you to today's Disability Inclusion Information Session. We're privileged to have with us today Christabel Feeney from Employers for Change. Christabel is Director of Employers for Change, which is an employer disability information service that provides advice and information to employers to recruit, employ, and retain employees with disabilities. Prior to Employers for Change, Christabel was Director of Organisation and Equality Lead for one of the country's main political parties. Since its foundation in 1904, ACCA has had a key role in facilitating a profession that's open to all as a core value. And inclusion is one of the core values, along with integrity and innovation, which are now ACCA's 3 core values, which link back to the unique reasons why ACCA was initially created more than a century ago. They reflect the difference that ACCA has brought to the global profession and the need to express them in a way that reflects our world today. It's important never to be complacent in this area. Ensuring that ACCA is a profession that's open to all and enables us to play a full and valuable role in society is fundamental to basically our reason for existing. It strongly supports ACCA's ethical stance. In Ireland, there's approximately 650,000 people who live with a disability, and that's 1 in 7 people. Yet, people with disabilities are twice as likely to be unemployed in Ireland compared to those without. There are many reasons for this, including both attitudinal, structural, and systemic barriers. A lack of knowledge and understanding is often one of the greatest barriers people with disabilities face. We're very fortunate to have Christabel with us for today's information session, as part of which she's going to broaden our understanding beyond visible disability, share knowledge on preferred language, and challenge the misconceptions that exist around disability. Part of ACCA's current strategy is to create opportunity for all by removing artificial barriers, creating connections, and embracing diversity. Following today's session, I'm sure you'll come away feeling more confident in your understanding of disability, with a greater level of knowledge about barriers faced by employees with disabilities. And I now have the honour of passing you across to Christabel for today's Disability Inclusion Information Session. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Jason, for your kind introduction. I am just going to share that screen, so you should all be able to see the slide in full there now. So as Jason mentioned, my name is Christabel Feeney, and in the spirit of complete and utter accessibility and inclusion, I'm going to share a visual descriptor of myself this afternoon. So I'm a white woman with long blonde hair and blue eyes, and I'm wearing a black short-sleeved dress and tights with a green and gold necklace. I am sitting in my living room as I'm working from home, and unfortunately or fortunately for some of you, at some point you're probably going to see a small dog moving behind me, so hopefully you only see her and you don't hear her. I am the Director of Employers for Change, and I'm really delighted to be here today to speak to the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants. I'm going to be talking to you about disability and how you can create a culture of inclusion within each of your organisations. So first, I just want to give you some context or further context to the work that we do. So as Jason mentioned, Employers for Change, it's an employer disability information service. We launched in March of 2021 in conjunction with the Open Doors Initiative. And our work is supported by the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. The purpose of our service is to empower employers with all of the information and advice needed so they can hire inclusively. That means employing, managing and retaining staff with disabilities. So how do we do that? Well, we provide a dedicated helpline where we give advice and information to employers. We have our website, employersforchange.ie, where we host an array of information. We provide and participate in awareness raising and outreach activities, and we maintain links with both employer stakeholders and disability stakeholders. A significant part of our work is also promoting the positive business case for the employment of people with disabilities. And all of our work is guided by a strategy group of both employer and disability stakeholder bodies. So that's just a little bit about the work that we do. And just to reiterate again, this service is completely free to all employers across the Republic of Ireland. That's private, public and semi-state. So if anybody has any queries at the end of this and you'd like to contact us directly, I'll be sharing details of how you can do that. So now let's just take a look at disability in an Irish context. And some of these figures have been mentioned already by Jason. So there are 643,141 people living in Ireland with a disability as of the 2016 census. That's a figure that's equivalent to more than the whole population of Connacht. So it's a really significant portion of the population. As mentioned, it's 1 in 7 people, 13.5% of the overall population. And yet people with disabilities in Ireland are half as likely to be in employment compared to their non-disabled peers. So actually that means if you have a disability in this country, you're more than twice as likely to be unemployed compared to somebody who isn't living with a disability. In that same census, 2016 census, 70% of people with a disability aged 20 to 64 acquires their disability after the age of 16. So what that tells us is that for many of us, it's likely that we will acquire a disability at some point during our working lives. So even though we might be here today and we might think that we don't have any direct experience or direct life experience of disability, it's certainly likely that we will at some point in the very near future. And we can see there that there is a significant portion of the population living with disabilities. And of course, with age, it's natural that disability increases, and therefore it's a natural part of the aging process. And so as our population ages, that figure is going to increase. And it's obviously a significant point in time since we had that census. It's 6 years at this stage. So those figures will all have increased since then. But now I want you to ask yourself a very important question. If you were to look at the figures that you can see on this slide, look at this from a sheer business perspective, ask yourself, would you consciously lose out on a market value worth 11 trillion euro? And surely the answer to that is going to be no. But the reality is that there's 1.3 billion people living globally with a disability. And together with family and friends, the spending power of the disabled community is just that. It's 11 trillion euro. So that's a really significant share of the market that people are passing up on when we're not hiring and we're not representing or presenting people with disabilities. So as an employer, you need to be representative of the people you serve in order to be successful. You can better serve your customers and your clients if you're representing them well. As well as that, the Deloitte Diversity and Inclusion Report 2020 found that companies who had a truly inclusive culture were 8 times more likely to achieve better outcomes, 3 times more likely to be high performing, and twice as likely to meet or exceed financial targets. When we're talking specifically about disability inclusion, we can see in the 2018 study by Accenture and Disability In that companies who were disability inclusion champions achieved on average 28% higher revenue over a 4-year period than those who weren't. So there's a very strong business case here for disability inclusion within any business, within any organisation. And it's really important that we're aware of that, because sometimes we think that, you know, inclusion is just something that's nice to do, but actually there's real significant value for you as employers and or as organisations to ensure that you are doing this as well for yourselves. So why then, if we know that disability inclusion is important, if we know that it's really good for business, if we know it's good for the culture of our organisation, why then is employment amongst the disabled community in Ireland so low? Well, there's a range of barriers and obstacles to employment experienced by both people with disabilities and potential employers. And some of those cited by potential employers include lack of awareness of disability or perception of what may be involved in the reasonable accommodations, and concerns over the costs related to those as well. Fear of legal liability, making a mistake, ending up down a litigious route, concerns about potential risks of employing a person with a disability, lack of knowledge of the challenges within the existing company policies and procedures for people with disabilities to navigate, lack of knowledge on how to proceed to proactively attract, to recruit, to retain staff with disabilities. And then employers can often experience challenges in maybe accessing the current supports that are provided by the Department of Social Protection, or have absolutely no awareness about those financial supports that are out there. So today we're going to try and address some of those barriers by building your knowledge and hopefully making you more disability confident at the end of this presentation. One of the first things that we're often asked is, what is disability? Or can you define disability? And there is no definitive list of conditions that constitute a disability. There are, of course, notable definitions that have been used in both legislation and official documents. Some of those include the Disability Act 2005, the Equality Acts 1998-2015, the 2016 Census, and the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So here I just briefly want to show you the 1998 to 2015 Employment Equality Act, and that defines disability as the total or partial absence of a person's bodily or mental functions, including the absence of a part of a person's body, the presence in the body of organisms causing or likely to cause chronic disease or illness, the malfunction, malformation or disfigurement of a part of a person's body, a condition or malfunction which results in a person learning differently from a person without the condition or malfunction, or a condition, illness or disease which affects a person's thoughts, processes, perception of reality, emotions or judgment, or which results in disturbed behaviour, and shall be taken to include a disability which exists at present, or which previously existed but no longer exists, or which may exist in the future, or which is imputed to a person. And so that last part there in particular is of importance, because it means that even though the person may not be living with this condition now, they may actually be living with a disability as a result of a condition that they had previously, or an illness that they had previously, and therefore they're protected by this legislation as well. So I'm only giving you that because that's a notable definition, and it's one that I'll reference later. The Equality Acts 1998-2015 is something I'm going to reference later, because that provides protections to people with disabilities. But that is quite a broad definition, but at the same time, it's also quite a medical, kind of a medical definition that's being used. So for the purpose of today, instead of really trying to define disability, which we can't really do, we're going to look at some examples of disabilities that people live with, so that we can understand that disability goes beyond physical disabilities. And we're going to look at that through three different categories. So we have visible disabilities, invisible or hidden disabilities, and then acquired disabilities. And a visible disability, it's something we can see or that we're aware of when we meet or speak to a person. And that's often a physical disability. So for example, it might be a person who's a wheelchair user. A hidden disability then refers to a disability that you might not see, or that's not visible at a glance, or that you might not be aware of a person having when we meet or we speak to them. It might even be somebody that we're working with. We might be working with them for the last decade, and we still might not be aware that they actually are living with a disability. So an invisible disability or hidden disability, that's really an umbrella term that captures a whole spectrum of disabilities. And some examples of that include things like attention deficit disorder, Crohn's disease, chronic fatigue syndrome, chronic pain, cystic fibrosis, diabetes, dyslexia, which actually 1 in 10 people live with dyslexia, and often It's diagnosed much later in life, and for a lot of people, they've created mechanisms to overcome the obstacles and the barriers, both in the workplace and outside of the workplace. So they haven't actually accessed some of the supports like the assistive technology supports that are out there. But we're seeing far more diagnosis of dyslexia later in life. Epilepsy is another one. Mental health illness, again, pre-COVID-19, we would have estimated that 1 in 4 people would experience mental health illness at some point during their lives. We know that the CSO carried out a social impact survey during COVID-19, and they found that 60% of people who filled out that survey said their mental health had been negatively impacted as a result of COVID living. So we know that that 1 in 4 figure will have increased significantly as a result of the last 2 years. And then it could be a visual or an auditory disability. So for example, you might be working remotely, or you could have been working remotely the last while. Somebody might have started work. They might have hearing loss, but they might use a hearing aid, or they might have a cochlear implant. And so actually you might not have any awareness that the person is living with hearing loss. And then the third one is an acquired disability. So that's a disability that's developed during the person's lifetime. You know, it's often as a result of an accident or an illness rather than a disability that the person was born with. And an acquired disability, it can be visible or invisible. So again, no definitive list, but examples include, you know, if we're talking about accident-related injuries, it could be head trauma, spinal injury, loss of vision, loss of hearing, injury or loss of limbs. If it's illness or health related, it could be something like post-stroke, post-traumatic stress, multiple sclerosis, arthritis, motor neuron disease, mental health illness, again, that can impact any of us at any stage in our lives. And the thing we need to remember when we're talking about acquired disability is that the disabled community is probably one of the only marginalised groups that any of us can become a member of overnight. So when we're having these discussions, as I said earlier, we're having them in a proactive way, not just a reactive way, because we might be working in an organisation where right now we feel we don't have anybody living with a disability who we need to support, but that can change at any time in the future, or any one of us can wake up tomorrow morning and we can have acquired a disability. So it's always important to remember that. And when we're talking about disabilities, I talked a minute ago about, you know, some definitions are quite medical. And here we're going to talk about the medical model of disability versus the social model of disability. So last year, Ireland published its draft initial report under the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And that convention, it's really underpinned by what we call the social model of disability. So here we have 2 diagrams. On the left, we have the medical model of disability. That model really rests on the assumption of what a disabled person cannot do because of a medical condition or an impairment. So for example, if you were thinking through the lens of the medical model, you might say something like, she can't walk, therefore she'll never be able to work. And then that medical model of disability focuses on trying to help the individual to walk again through operations or equipment. And that model really locates the source of what it sees as the problem as the individual disabled person. So in doing that, it really places all responsibility for the situation onto the disabled person and completely away from society and how it's run and how it's organised. Next to that, then, we have the social model of disability. And this picture here just shows us some of the thinking and assumptions around that model. So the social model holds that people with disabilities are disabled by the barriers operating in society that exclude and discriminate against them. So an example of that would be if we were to look at a building with lots of steps, no lift, no ramp access. It isn't the wheelchair that's disabling the wheelchair user, but in fact, it's the way we have built the building. And so that really encourages us to look at our own attitudes, structures around us, the systems and the procedures that we as an organisation or organisations put in place that really restrict and disable the individual, as opposed to assuming that an individual has any sort of limitations themselves. So that's the model that we want to work towards, and that's the degree of understanding that we need to create for ourselves and our organisations around disability. So we've considered there some of the diverse disabilities that people live with, and we've looked at the social model of disability. And now I just want you to think about language. So language is one of the first things that's asked of us. You know, what's the correct language? What's the right terminology? People are often really afraid of causing offense. You know, we're worrying about what language we should use around disability. And of course, language matters. You know, we should always be respectful of people and of their feelings. And when it comes to disability, some people advocate for what's called people first or person first language. And with that, it places emphasis on the person first and the disability second. So you can see there, we would say in that instance, if we were using person first language, you would say a person with a disability. Then on the other hand, some disabled people prefer what they call identity first language and would say that, you know, I'm not a person with a disability, but rather I am a disabled person. And so prefer to be identified as a disabled person as opposed to a person with a disability. And again, that ties in with the social model that we discussed in the last slide, where we recognise that individuals are disabled by society, by attitudes and by structures. But irrespective of which language is used, we have to remember the person is central. We should not objectify an individual by using language like the disabled. Also, if we're talking about somebody who's a wheelchair user, you would say the person is a wheelchair user or person using a wheelchair. You should not use terminology like wheelchair bound. Avoid words like sufferer or suffers from. Again, all of these things have very negative connotations and place limitations on the person. And in Ireland, either of those terminologies, you know, person with a disability or a disabled person, are acceptable. And you can be guided by the individual as well. We always say to people, you will never go wrong either by just calling somebody by their name. You don't always have to overanalyze and over worry about the language, but it is good to be aware that either of these terminologies are acceptable. And the last thing I would say about that is don't fear the word disability. So sometimes we're afraid of using the word disability. It isn't a dirty word. The disabled community are happy for people to use the word disability. And, you know, don't feel the need to kind of, often companies can make up words. We can say things like diverse ability or different things. And that's fine if it's guided by individuals in the organisation with lived experience of disability. But it isn't if it's a case that non-disabled people are kind of creating terminology and words to make themselves feel comfortable because they're uncomfortable with the word disability. So there can be lots of misconceptions about disability, and I mentioned that earlier as being one of the barriers. And it's really important to remember that just because a person has a disability, it doesn't mean that they're less qualified for a job, does not mean that they're less talented or less ambitious. And in fact, people with disabilities bring a range of skills and expertise, phenomenal problem solvers, having to navigate life often in a much more complex way than non-disabled peers. People with disabilities have actually inspired great technological change with innovations like closed captioning. You know, we're using the live caption, live transcript today, voice activation, spell check, all of these things that we often use on a day-to-day basis and we actually take completely for granted. And it's actually because of these innovative technologies that many employers and businesses were able to continue operating remotely during the pandemic. Again, we might have misconceptions about disabilities based on one previous experience or one person that we know. But we have to remember that every individual is totally different. You know, we have to challenge those misconceptions, and we also have to challenge ourselves around, you know, how jobs can be done too, and understand that jobs can often be done in alternative ways. And people with disabilities will bring a unique perspective and often encourage companies to see things from their view. So that can really help an organisation approach customers in a new way, lead to new innovations that are inclusive of the maximum number of consumers, which is what any profitable business or organisation wants. And here in this slide, we have three pictures on top of each other of three different people, and they're all well-known people. But each of these individuals have lived with a disability. So the first person there is Agatha Christie. She's believed to have had a learning disability and she had problems with handwriting and spelling. As a result, she actually dictated all of her novels. So Agatha Christie has sold more than 2 billion books worldwide. She wrote more than 90 novels and 24 collections of short stories. A misconception that a lot of people would have is that if you had a learning disability, if you had problems with handwriting and spelling, the very last thing you would be good at is being a writer or being a novelist. But she just decided to do it in a different way to how others might do it. And she dictated those books in a time when dictation was almost unheard of. The second person there is Millie Bobby Brown. She's the Stranger Things actress, and she lives with partial hearing loss, having lost hearing completely in one of her ears. But that hasn't stopped her from being one of the youngest Emmy nominees of all time at 13 years of age. Again, a person could assume that if you had, partial hearing loss, that a very busy film set, recording set, that might not be a viable option as a career for an individual. But she's been so successful. And then the third person is Albert Einstein. He's obviously the famous mathematician and physicist, and he had a learning disability and didn't speak until he was 3 years of age. He found maths and writing really difficult at school, and then went on to become one of the best known scientists of all time, having won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1921. Again, a misconception many of us would probably have is that if you find maths really difficult and writing really difficult in school, the last thing you do is go on to win a Nobel Prize for Physics years later. But again, we have to understand that often people with disabilities, they might reach their goals in a different way to how a non-disabled person would. They might navigate life in a different way. They might navigate their career in a different way. But it doesn't make them less creative. It doesn't make them less innovative. And it certainly doesn't make them any less talented. So in all three cases here, we have people with disabilities who have gone on to be immensely successful. And in some instances, like Agatha Christie, they've actually found a different way to that success to how a non-disabled person might. So you want and you need these talented people in your organisation. So we have to ask ourselves, how can we become more inclusive and in turn attract this talent pool? I'm going to very briefly look at reasonable accommodations, which provide support to employees and job seekers with disabilities. So I mentioned earlier about the Employment Equality Acts 1998-2015, and that's a really important piece of legislation for any employer. This act actually places an obligation on employers to provide an employee who has a disability with reasonable accommodations, and that's referred to in the act as an appropriate measure. The reasonable accommodation is something that helps to alleviate a substantial disadvantage due to an impairment or a medical condition. And the purpose of providing the reasonable accommodation is to enable a person who has a disability to have access to employment, to participate or advance in employment, or to undergo training. So employers must also make accommodations to enable people with disabilities to return to work having acquired a disability, as well as to participate in the job application process, and also to enjoy the benefits and privileges that are accorded to other employees within the organisation. As an employer, if you have to make changes to the workplace or work practices to accommodate a disabled employee, the demands should be reasonable and therefore should not impose a disproportionate burden on you. So in other words, the changes and the cost should be realistic for the business to bear, depending on several factors, such as the nature and the cost of the accommodation requested, the overall financial resources of the employer and the number of employees, the impact of the accommodation on the operations of the business. But under the equality legislation, you as an employer are not obliged to provide special treatment or facilities if the cost of doing that is excessive or disproportionate. But as an employer, you have to consider, possible sources of funding, such as the supports and grants that are provided by the Department of Social Protection when you're assessing the cost of a particular accommodation. And I'm going to just give you a brief overview of what some of those grants are. But I would say to people, it's really important to remember that actually often accommodations have no cost. We know that AHEAD carried out research about 2 years ago, and they found that actually 2/3 of accommodations requested had no cost, and that the other third, there were things that were actually readily available in the organisation. So often an accommodation can be related maybe to job tasks. It can be an accommodation around working hours, the splitting of working hours, later start times, things like that. So just I would say to people, don't fear the cost element, because it really is a myth that there are huge costs. It's not always about ripping down walls or structures. A lot of it is actually really about just accommodating the very basic needs of the individual. So I mentioned there about the government supports, and so I just want to give you a quick overview of that. So I have 3 different grants here that I'm going to run through. The first one there is the Disability Awareness Training Grant. And that goes up to €20,000 to provide full training to employees within your organisation. And all of these grants are available to private sector employers. So that's a really significant grant, and I'd encourage everybody to consider getting that for their organisation, where you can actually go and get certified training for your employees on disability awareness. And it really showcases your commitment, I suppose, to being an inclusive employer, and will show your employees as well that you're really committed to this. The second one there is the Reasonable Accommodation Fund. So there's 4 grants that fall within that fund. So first of all, we have the Workplace Equipment Adaptation Grant. That goes up to €6,350. There are some circumstances where they will extend that a little bit more if the accommodation requires it. And it would often be for new or to upgrade equipment. So things like assistive technology that's required for the person. The second strand of that is the Personal Reader Grant. Again, that's for job related reading. And it allows the individual to bring in somebody into the organisation for work-related purposes to read work-related text for them if they have, low vision or sight loss. The third strand of that then is the Job Interview Interpreter Grant. So again, this allows for you to organise a job interview interpreter for an individual who requires an Irish Sign Language interpreter to come to the interview, but also for the induction stage as well. And that's really important, because that can be a very daunting thing for somebody who's an Irish Sign Language user, particularly the induction period. So really, really good grant to be aware of. And then the fourth strand of that is the Employee Retention Grant. So the Employee Retention Grant has 2 stages. And this is really to support the return to work of an employee who has acquired a disability. The first stage of that grant allows for you to bring in an outside consultant to assess the needs of the individual and what changes might need to be made, either to their job, maybe there's some elements of the previous job that they will no longer be able to carry out, or if there's any structural issues within the organisation. So it really is that grant's really there to ensure that the individual can come back to work. And then stage 2 of that grant, that's up to €12,500. So again, that allows you to implement the recommendations made in the first part by the consultant. So a really significant grant as well. And then the third overall grant there is the Wage Subsidy Scheme. So that has 3 strands to it. It provides a financial incentive to private sector employers to employ people with disabilities who work 21 hours or more per week, up to 39 hours. The rate of the subsidy is €6.30 per hour. That's as of January of 2022. And the amount of the subsidy is really based on the number of hours worked. But the maximum annual subsidy payable is €12,776 per year, based on a 39-hour week. So there's more details of those grants on employersforchange.ie, and I would encourage you to go and take a look at our website, and you'll be able to delve into different aspects of what we talked about this afternoon. But if you need more information on any part of this, you can also contact us directly, and I'll have the details, our contact details at the end. So then this is just the last slide. So I just want you to take on board everything that we've talked about this afternoon and take a look at this picture. So we have 2 images that look very similar here. We see that on the left, there are 3 people trying to watch a football match. There's a wooden fence in front of them. The man is really tall. He's standing on a box, but he can actually see well above the fence line. So he's a really clear view of the game, even if he didn't have that box to stand on. Next to him is a woman who's of shorter stature. She's the same height box. She can just skim the fence. She can get a little bit of a view, but it's not complete, it's not completely accessible to her. And then the person next to her is a wheelchair user, and the box is of no use to them. So they don't have any access to watching the match. They're literally just looking at the fence. And so they've each been given the same means of access, even though their needs are really different. And that's what we call equality, treating people equally. And we've used that word for many, many years, but it isn't addressing individual needs or individual differences. In an image next to that, then we see that we've the same 3 people, but in this image, the man no longer has a box to stand on. He's tall enough, he can see well above the fence line. He has a clear view of the match. The woman has been given a second box, and she's now able to see the game clearly. And then the third person, who's a wheelchair user, has been given a ramp. And so now they can watch the game with their friends. They have a full view of the game, but actually nothing about the game itself has changed. Just their access needs have been met. And that's what we call equity. So when we recognize diversity and individuality, and we create workplaces that allow for individual needs, we're creating an inclusive work environment. That means creating equitable employment where people's needs are met on a case-by-case basis. I know that there's going to be future sessions between Employers for Change and your organisation, where there'll be much more information given around the reasonable accommodations piece, and what can be provided to employees and examples of that. But it's really important that we're providing those reasonable accommodations to ensure that accessibility and inclusion is at our core values within our organisations. So just to take away from today, I would say to you, do remember that the disabled community has a very significant amount of power here, that they have a very important role to play in any organisation, that they have significant spending power in the market. And so this is not a community that we want or should be excluding. Again, remember, we don't always need to define disability. Sometimes people kind of get stuck on that, but instead we need to understand the different disabilities that people live with. Always reflect on that social model of disability where we recognise that our attitudes, the societal attitudes, the societal structures and systems are placing barriers and limitations in individuals, not any specific medical condition. Remember, people with disabilities are talented individuals. Always consider the language that you're using as well. And remember, the disability isn't a dirty word. We want to create equitable employment opportunities for people, and there are lots of financial supports out there for you to do that. So that brings my presentation to an end. I'm just in about the time, I'd say, Lloyd.
And I'm going
to stop sharing now, and I'll take any questions that people might have.
Fantastic. Before we get to that, I just wanted to say thank you very much for today. That was such an enlightening and entertaining session. I hope everyone else got as much out of it as I did today. I think this is also I think every call that you and I've had so far, your dog has managed to sneak into the background to try to steal some of the limelight, but thankfully she's disappeared. I'm going to stop the recording there and see if there's any questions that have come up.